There are shadows over this place, and dark rules ahead. That's right, today is another maddening mechanic breakdown as we go over the mechanics of shadows over Innistrad.
Judge's Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com, the best online retailer for Magic the Gathering singles and sealed product, and GatheringMagic.com, your place to explore the game. Now it's time for Judge's Corner.
First up is Delirium, a mechanic reminiscent of the Terror Tarmogoyf. Delirium grants cards additional effects if you have at least 4 different card types in your graveyard. Each Delirium effect is different, so you'll need to read the cards carefully to know what disturbed state of mind you're encountering. The 8 different card types that'll engage Delirium are Creature, Enchantment, Artifact, Land, Instant, Sorcery, Planeswalker, and the rarest, Tribal. Supertypes like Basic or Legendary, or subtypes like Curse or Werewolf, do not count towards Delirium. But, just so you know, many cards do have more than one card type on them, like Shardless Agent. Keep in mind that some Delirium triggers have an intervening if clause on them, which means that if you don't have 4 or more card types in your graveyard, it won't even trigger in the first place. And then, when it would go to resolve, if you don't have 4 or more card types in your graveyard, it simply doesn't. Delirium activated abilities just have a restriction, only allowing them to be activated while you're delirious. And if you somehow lose Delirium while the ability is being activated, it'll still go on to resolve as it would normally. Most sorcery and instant spells with Delirium have an added effect, and they check only as the spell goes to resolve. Keep in mind that spells with Delirium on the stack are just that, on the stack, and not in the graveyard. So you can't count the spell with Delirium for its own Delirium. Next up on our investigation is Investigate. Whenever an ability or spell allows you to investigate, you put a clue artifact token onto the battlefield with the ability of pay 2 mana, sacrifice this artifact, draw 1 card. Although cryptic in nature, Investigate and clues are pretty straightforward. Our next new ability, Skulk, is an evasive mechanic found on creatures. It says, creatures with Skulk cannot be blocked by other creatures with greater power. For example, a Farbog Revenant could only be blocked by something with 1 power or less. By the way, less does mean less, so creatures with negative power can block creatures with Skulk. Now, if we do block Farbog Revenant with a 1/3 Seagraft Scab, then that Farbog Revenant is now considered blocked. That means we can do things like pump our blocking Seagraft Scab from a 1/3 to a 3/5 with an instant spell like Aim High, which will end up killing the Revenant. Another way to get around Skulk is to block the Farbog Revenant with 3 Seagraft Scabs, which would be enough combat damage to kill it. The next mechanic we're examining is Total Madness. No, it's really the returning mechanic, Madness. If you remember it from Torment way back in 2002, then it's essentially the same, but with some minor changes to the way it functions. If you discard a card with Madness, you exile it instead of putting it into your graveyard. This causes Madness to trigger, allowing you to cast the spell for its Madness cost, or put it into your grave from exile. The change here is that previously you would have the option to exile the card with Madness to cast it for its alternate cost, or to put it directly into your graveyard. But now there is no option. It puts the card into the exile zone no matter what. This matters for cards like Jace, Varin's Prodigy. So, for example, if we have exactly 4 cards in our graveyard and activate Jace's ability, discarding Fiery Temper doesn't discard to the graveyard. It's actually discarded to the exile zone. Then, when Jace's ability finishes resolving, it'll see 4 cards we still have in our graveyard and not transform. After that, we go back to Fiery Temper and decide if we want to cast it for its Madness cost or put it into the graveyard. Madness doesn't care how it was discarded. As long as the card with the Madness ability is discarded, Madness goes into effect. And, by the way, casting a spell with Madness is an alternate cost, so it can still be countered just like if it was cast normally. The last important and beneficial part of Madness is that when casting the spell for its Madness cost, the ability ignores any restrictions the card's types may have. What do I mean? Well, let's say your opponent activates their Liliana of the Veil's first ability, that forces each player to discard a card. The card we so happen to discard has Madness, and we have the mana to pay for it. But it's our opponent's turn, and it's a sorcery spell. Does this mean we can cast it via Madness? The answer is yes, because Madness is maddening. Actually, the real reason is that Madness doesn't care when the card is discarded, so long as it is discarded. So cast your creatures as if they had flash, or sorceries as if they were instants. The last mechanic is one that has transformed card design forever, double-face cards. The mechanic is essentially the same as when we last talked about it. Double-face cards have 2 faces, allowing them to switch sides when specific conditions are met. Each side of a double-face card has 2 sets of characteristics. be it 2 entirely different colors, 2 different power or toughnesses, and possibly entirely different effects. When a card transforms to its other side, it's still the same object as before, so that means it keeps any auras, equipments, and counters that are on it. This obviously doesn't apply to the 5 Planeswalkers from Origins, and that's because they exile themselves first and enter the battlefield again as a transformed card. You can represent double-faced cards with a checklist card, either because you don't have sleeves, or your sleeves aren't entirely opaque. When you do so, all copies of double-faced cards must either be represented by a checklist card or not, and you must have the corresponding card for each checklist card you have in your deck. When it comes to the converted mana cost of double-faced cards, it's always the same as the front face. This means a Ravager of the Fells has a converted mana cost of 4 because that's the converted mana cost of Huntmaster of the Fells. This wasn't the case back when the original Innistrad was in Standard. Back then, the converted mana cost was 0 for the transformed side, and that's because the transformed side doesn't have a mana cost. However, a copied Ravager of the Fells via a Clever Impersonator actually has a converted mana cost of 0 because it doesn't have a second face to reference. If something would enter the battlefield transformed, but it isn't a double-faced card, it stays where it is. This matters especially for something like a Clever Impersonator copying a Loyal Cathar, because when the cloned Cathar would die and then later trigger to return, it actually doesn't, because it cannot return transformed since it doesn't have another back. Lastly, if a card is trying to transform itself more than once, it just transforms once. This applies to things like Archangel Avacyn, in that if the ability triggers more than once, all of those triggers will go on the stack, but the most recent one will resolve, transforming it into the Purifier. And that's it. The other triggers will do nothing when they go to resolve because Avacyn already transformed. Well, that's it for our episode. If you still want to investigate further, go ahead and send us an email at judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And if you still don't have a clue, go ahead and leave a comment below, and myself or someone else will be happy to get back to you. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, and if you dislike this video, well, that's just madness. Until next time, make sure to shuffle thoroughly, play at a reasonable pace, and have fun.